of about 20
This
minutes or so.
meeting is being recorded.
Okay. First of all, we have Gillian Bentley, who's a professor of anthropology at Durham University. She's also a fellow of the Wolfson Research Institute for Health and Wellbeing. She trained in the US and the UK, and she's really become a leader in evolutionary medicine. She's worked globally in some fascinating and really important populations, including the Middle East, Africa, South America, and has two major research foci. One is the effects of childhood development on reproduction and health across the lifespan, and obesity and later life health. The second person in this group of three is John Gorman. He studied engineering at Cambridge and then worked in engineering and electronics in England, the US, and Germany. In the 1980s, he turned his attention to the structure and evolution of the human spine, and eventually to the design and manufacture of chairs and car seats, particularly for pelvic or iliac support. He then trained as a chiropractor and practiced for 25 years. He's now retired, but continues to write and do research related to lower back pain and associated issues. And our third person on this panel, an author on the paper that was shared, is Charlotte Roberts. She's an emeritus professor of archaeology at Durham University and a fellow of the British Academy. She initially trained and practiced as a nurse, but then studied archaeology and bioarchaeology and became a leader in the field of paleopathology. And her research focuses on the interaction of people with their environments in the past through patterns of health and disease, with a special interest in health problems that are common today. And I should point out that Charlotte and Gillian are co-editors, along with several others, of a really nice book that I want to encourage others to check out, called Paleopathology and Evolutionary Medicine. Is that published by Oxford? Is that an Oxford? OUP?
Mm-hmm. Yep,
so it's an OUP book. I'll find a link and share that after I share the other information. And they're also organizing a special issue, a collection of articles on paleopathology for evolution medicine and public health. Okay, I think that covers everything. Thank you guys so much for joining, and I'll turn things over to you for your presentation and then hopefully a hearty discussion afterwards. Thank you.
Okay, thank you so much, Charlie. Thanks. So yeah, let me just share the screen. Okay, can everybody see that and can they hear us?
Everything looks great.
Great. Okay, so yeah, so today the three of us, I'll do the presentation, but the three of us are here to answer questions around this issue of does habitual squatting ease childbirth, which is the topic of our paper that was published this year in Evolution Medicine and Public Health. And thanks again to Charlie and Becca for inviting us to do the presentation. So I thought I'd give you just a history of the paper, because you may wonder how come an archaeologist, an anthropologist, and an engineer started to collaborate on this issue. So back in 2019, John sent us a paper, which is what you see down below here, Truly Natural Childbirth Requires a Squatting Lifestyle. He sent me this paper, having found me, I guess, on the web, excuse me. And knowing that I was an anthropologist who worked on issues to do with reproductive health. And I thought his ideas were intriguing, so I had a chat with Charlotte. And then eventually, it wasn't until 2020, because of our busy schedules, that we Zoomed with John and had some time to talk about perhaps trying to incorporate his ideas into a paper that could hit up a wider audience. And that's what led to us eventually publishing the paper in EMPH. So what I want to do first is introduce you to a cultural meme that maybe, since most of you are probably in the USA, you might not be that familiar with. It's a British cultural meme, and it's about Marmite. So I can't see any of you on the screen, but it's the same as Vegemite, basically, which many of you may have heard of. But I'm sure that if you haven't grown up with Marmite, probably most of you here in the audience hate it if you tasted it. But Marmite has become, their big advertising campaign is either you love it or you hate it. And I wanted to introduce it because I think from our reviews of our paper when we submitted it, it's what we would call a Marmite paper. And here's another one of the adverts for Marmite here, dividing the nation. And given the political situation that Britain's in right now, we can say that we have Marmite politicians. That gives you some idea about how we use that terminology. So first I'll talk about the likes then, the comments that we got that were very positive about the paper, because one of the things that we want to do in this talk is generate discussion that will deal with some of the criticisms, I think, that were raised in the reviews. So here are some of the comments about the paper. They liked the work, they thought it was a thorough review of the obstetrical dilemma, introduced detailed osteology and biomechanics, and so forth. And then I'm going to park the hate it bit until a bit later when we talk about the problems. So let me talk about the basics of the paper, and hopefully most of you had a chance at least to read it. So I really am just giving an outline of the issues. And as we go through, we've got about a 3-minute video that we thought was really important to present because it gives the opportunity for John to address some of the main biomechanical engineering principles that informed the paper. So what we talk about in the paper is that basically current obstetrical difficulties, i.e. difficulties in childbirth, are not reflective of how our hunter-gatherer ancestors would have experienced parturition. And apologies, this is not a hunter-gatherer figurine, but I just thought it was a very nice figurine in showing a woman squatting and giving birth. But we assume that our hunter-gatherer ancestors probably would have squatted habitually. And habitual squatting, we argue, allows greater flexion of the sacra-iliac joint by as much as 25 to 30 degrees, whereas the current estimates, if you read anatomy books, would be about 2 degrees. So we're arguing for much, much greater flexion. And in this video, John goes into more details about that. But with this greater flexion, the argument is that the pelvic outlet could widen by as much as 2 centimeters above current estimates. So with that, that would facilitate a much easier parturition experience for women. But obviously this needs further testing, and that will, you'll see more when we talk about some of the criticisms of the paper. And then part of the basics of the paper too, and this was where Charlotte comes in, so any questions about the bioarchaeological bits will go to Charlotte. But there's various ways in which in the bioarchaeological record, which would probably be one of the best sources of data for squatting in past populations, there are a number of features in the record that we could use to try and reconstruct whether our ancestors were squatting or not. So here's a list of some of them: retroversion of the tibia. I won't read them all through, but squatting facets is one of them. And these, again, if you have questions about that, Charlotte will be able to address these. We also suggested that once agriculture was introduced and developed by humans, and we know from the paleopathological record that there are a large number of nutritional deficiencies and problems that emerged for populations that practiced agriculture, that very likely with that, there may have been much greater problems with childbirth, because women we know who are malnourished often develop what's referred to as flatter pelvises that make childbirth much more difficult. And then even more important perhaps is, as people become more settled, we begin to increasingly use either stools or chairs and stop squatting. So we've moved away from this lifestyle where habitual squatting was the norm, and where people are no longer basically practicing a lifestyle that would have allowed this greater flexion at the sacro-iliac joint. Okay, so here's the point where we're going to show the video. There's just a few seconds delay to allow you to read this first part before it kicks in.
This back of the pelvis demonstrates that a rotation of either ilium about an axis from the interosseous sacra-iliac to the pubic symphysis. This is what happens in every walking stride, and that there not any guiding motion at the inferior leg of the sacro-iliac joint, because these joint surfaces separate on flexion. It is this movement that occurs alternately, not simultaneously, walking or running. of an ilium is a rotation and the system on the strip of the pelvis. This axis of rotation must pass through the pubic symphysis and the interosseous sacra-iliac near the superior leg of the L-shaped sacra-iliac joint. This leg joint points approximately to the pubic symphysis, meaning that no slide is necessary, just a rocking motion of this superior leg of the L-shaped sacra-iliac joint. The inferior leg of the sacra-iliac joint separates on flexion of the joint and closes up on extension. It is this closing of the inferior leg of the sacra-iliac joint that provides the end stop to the movement of each ilium. So the functions of two legs of the L-shaped sacro-iliac joint are completely different. Almost just look upon them as different bits. If we look at the front of the pelvis in the standing position and repeat the twisting, we can evaluate the twist between the two ilia at the depth of the anterior superior iliac spines. My fingers are pointing to these below the iliac crests, which are level with one another. This is how McTimoney chiropractors evaluated the pelvis. The patient was supine on the bench, and we checked that this movement was present. Magnitude of the height difference surprisingly similar to that in this plastic pelvis. A couple of centimeters or so, maybe in some subjects, regular runners, for instance. Looking again at the sacro-iliac joint when this risk occurs, the deviation between these two red marks is about 20 millimeters at a radius of about 40 millimeters from the interosseous sacro-iliac figure. This is a fraction of 25 or 30 degrees. This sacro-iliac flexion normally occurs only alternately. If this did occur simultaneously at both sacro-iliac joints, the AP diameter of the pelvic outlet would be increased by 20 or 25 millimeters, about an inch. And note, the shape of the ligamentous area superior to the inferior leg of the joint means that the lateral pelvic outlet diameter between the iliac spines is also increased, and by about the same amount, 2 centimeters or thereabouts. The implications for childbirth are obvious, and note these estimates are based on male and female subjects. The hormonal effects on ligaments will presumably result in significantly greater increases in the late stages of pregnancy.
Let me just get back in here.
Hey, Gillian.
Yeah.
Hey, Gillian. Can you hear me?
Yes.
That cut
Yeah.
out in a few places. It was a little bit hard to hear. Is that video available for people to look at? Could we share a link to it perhaps afterwards? I think I got the gist of it and most of it. I don't think we need to redo it, but I don't know if other people are having that problem.
A longer version is available actually as the supplemental material with the articles, so they should be able to get it there. We just truncated it. But I'll just go back in and share the screen again. Hang on.
Okay, I see a supplementary data table. I didn't know if that had the video in it, but okay. It might help.
Yeah, so
just,
can you see that?
We can see that. It might help to, if there's anything you want to kind of amplify about the video, just to make sure everybody understands the gist of what was there, I think that might be a good idea.
Okay, shall I just finish the presentation, then maybe John can amplify the video at the end?
That's a great idea, just to get a little bit more at the mechanism. Thank you.
Yeah. Okay, thanks for telling us about that. So just to get back then about squatting, and there's a lot of literature out there about the benefits of squatting apart from childbirth. So people talk about the position being better for defecation purposes, preventing organ prolapse, lower back pain. But we did want to point out that the kind of squat that people do in a gym is not the kind of squat that we're talking about here. These are not really a natural squat. But this is the squat that we're talking about, the so-called deep squat, where you can see in these pictures of people who presumably do squat fairly regularly, they're kind of sitting on their haunches. And the other thing is that their feet are flat on the ground. We would find it very difficult to do that if we hadn't done this for several years. And in this video here, if you want to watch it afterwards when the slides are posted up, it was very nice. I found it on YouTube because this Australian man was demonstrating how he can't do this kind of squat, but he used his kid to demonstrate, and also the center of gravity, that the kid could do it very, very naturally. Note the position of the feet on the floor. So it's this kind of squat that, that we are talking about, and that we would find it almost impossible to do unless you practiced it. So then this brings me to the hate it Marmite part of the talk, and to go through some of the criticisms that we received, because that hopefully will generate some more discussion as well. So some of the criticisms were that John used a plastic model of a pelvis, and that we didn't have any estimates of things like ligament elasticity or strength, and that we didn't have any data from examining women using MRI scanners. And there are quite a few studies. This one here in the picture on the bottom right comes from one of those studies about women who are squatting in different positions during childbirth, who volunteer, not actually while they're giving birth, but to go into these MRI scanners. So just to deal with these one at a time, first of all, with the plastic model of the pelvis, we did want to point out that in medical schools nowadays, these high-grade, really good replicas of pelvis are routinely used in medical schools. And on top of that, there are real issues associated with using human skeletons these days. And so we didn't think there was a problem really with using a very good plastic model. And then no estimates of ligament elasticity or strength. No, we don't have that, but we do know that humans can develop, with sufficient practice, amazing ability to stretch their ligaments. And these are extreme examples that go above and beyond habitual squatting, I'm sure. And then no examination of women using MRI scanners. And to do that, you really need to be in a medical setting or have access to a medical setting, and presumably a very large grant and access to these MRI machines. And it's possible that hopefully others with these resources may be inspired to test our ideas further. And then just to go through some of the existing data of these studies that have been done with pregnant women and who give birth, especially in the second stage of labor, so the pushing stage, and how they adopt different positions, including squatting. So there have been one recent meta-analysis, and then also a Cochrane review about women adopting different positions, including squatting. And these reviews found that at least there was a reduction in the time spent during the second stage of labor. But the quality of the studies was described as poor, both for the Cochrane review and for the meta-analysis. So they didn't have a huge amount of confidence in the outcome. And we would point out that if you're going to do such studies with living populations, we don't really have an ideal population to test, because current human populations that do squat regularly, like in parts of India, for example, or in parts of Africa, usually low and middle income countries, where populations, because they're poor, are generally not as well nourished as one would like them to be if you're going to test a theory of this sort, and not confound the study by the fact that women may have experienced poor nutrition during development, which might have altered their pelvic morphology. And then many women in low and middle income countries might also be giving birth as teens, which we know is also problematic for obstetric outcomes, exacerbated by the fact that some of these teens may also have experienced nutritional deficits during development. And then, of course, working in such populations, you've got the logistics of trying to get people to an MRI scanner, even if they would agree to do it, and the additional cost on top of that. Okay, so just to conclude, hopefully this paper will encourage other people to test the ideas further, and will be a nice basis to get some discussion and debate going in this club EvMed. So let me stop sharing here. Okay, we back with you?
Okay, great. Thank you, Gillian. Thank you very much. Did John or Charlotte, did you want to add anything before we open it up for discussion?
Why don't we just open it up for discussion, I think.
What about
Okay.
the video? Are you going to, do you want to talk about the video? Talk about the video? Or just...
The video that we've already shown, which didn't come
Yes.
across completely. I don't think I can say much more. It would be silly to rerun it. I hope the questions will open everything up. Is that the best way of doing it?
I think that's fine. I think it would be hard to talk about it, you know, without the supporting images and everything. Sorry about that, everyone. I think it must have been something to do with Zoom, trying to show a video over Zoom. You know, it seemed like it worked beforehand, but not so well once we had everybody on Zoom. I think that's fine. I think, and it's in the supplementary material, so people can check that out if they want to see it.
It's also available on my website, which is called trulynaturalchildbirth.uk.
Okay.
Trulynaturalchildbirth.uk. So that, you know, it's just the video is there.
Okay. Okay, so we have plenty of time for discussion. We'd love to hear from people in the audience. Does anyone have any questions they'd like to ask? We have we have one question from Peggy C. Hafer. Would you like to ask your question, Peggy?
Okay, hi, my name is Peggy. I'm a midwife and a physical anthropologist. And I have a question. During the development of today's population, the people have grown very tall. If you think about European people are nearly 2 meters high or 180. And I think maybe the fetus inside is not grown in the same way as we became taller. And maybe the shape of the pelvis would be compensated. I'm mostly interested in birth injuries, but now I think as we had the question before, do we have less births, lacerations in women who wear squatting all day? So that's why I'm really interested in that. But I'm not sure if the size of the baby is grown in the same way as we became taller. Do we have any data about early birth sites?
Not a lot, I should think. Can I throw out one example? The Kung, the very small people in the middle of Africa. Kung is not the current name.
Yeah, Jupanzi, I don't know exactly how you
Anyway,
pronounce
we're
it.
talking about the small people who live in the Kalahari area of Africa. Their babies are the same size as our babies, 7 pounds or thereabouts. And it appears to me from the limited information available that they have a very steep sacral angle. In other words, the pelvis has opened up permanently among those women in order to accommodate the fact that they've got smaller while the babies haven't. That's just one small example. Another possible example is that in the town of Da Nang in Vietnam, which people of my age will remember as being a part of the Vietnam War, but not any longer. It's a very civilized modern town. The cesarean rate is something like 80%. Could it be that people who were squatting only one generation ago, in other words, the children of mothers who squatted, don't now squat because they're living a car and secretarial lifestyle or computer-born lifestyle, that their pelvis has not expanded to accommodate the problem, which our babies in Britain, for instance, have had to, our women have had to adapt to over maybe 4,000 years, from the time when squatting was normal in Britain to the time when now squatting is not normal in Britain. Have I answered your question at all?
Can I just add something to that? But I mean, we think anyway, from the limited data that I know about, that our hunter-gatherer ancestors were taller than many populations that have come since. And since the Industrial Revolution, certain countries like Scandinavian countries, where people are among the tallest in the world, have regained the height that was lost during many millennia, if you like, of agricultural development, where people became shorter. So it's possible that our hunter-gatherer ancestors were as tall or close to some of the taller populations that exist in the world today. So when you're trying to say that maybe these very tall women are giving birth to babies that develop differently, it's possible that it was similar when we were living a healthier hunter-gatherer lifestyle, but that's somewhat speculative.
Can I add one thing? What I probably didn't mention in my bit of the answer is we are talking about a very significant increase in both pelvic outlet diameters in comparison with anything which appears in the literature. The literature basically says that there's around about 2 degrees of flexion at the sacra-iliac joint, and incidentally that can either be extension or flexion for the same movement of the body. So its averages of 0. We are talking in this this hypothesis that that flexion of the sacro-iliac joint should be around about 30 degrees in everyone, not just in females or pregnant females, but in male and female.
Okay, thanks. It was just about the shape of the pelvic bone and not about the hiatus, but it leads to more questions. Do we see do we see less birth lacerations if you have an overstretched pelvic floor? Maybe you don't see that. Or do we see more prolapse or decent bladder things in older women there in the squatting population? But maybe it will come with the next presentations. I will wait.
Can I try and answer that one, just about the pelvic floor? In our lifestyle, the pelvic floor has one shape. The sacrum is fixed in comparison with the ischial tuberosities and the pubic symphysis, and it doesn't expand much. If you take a membrane like a drum, which does not expand, and you put a weight on it, and what is the tension in the membrane? Well, as a first approximation, it's infinite. Okay, it bows a bit. But if you have a membrane which is in its resting shape flat, but in normal walking or jumping is a bowed, a sagging shape, then the tension is infinitely less. I don't know whether people get that point, but in other words, I'm saying that the idea that an expanding pelvic outlet is likely to cause pelvic floor problems is actually the contrary of the truth in engineering.
Okay, we will see.
Thank you for that question. Thank you for that question. Yes, it'd be nice if we had some follow-ups on this. It's such an important topic, and there's so much exciting work going on the obstetric dilemma. We have a couple more questions in the chat. Cynthia, it looked like you had a question. Cynthia Bell, I don't know if you're still on. It looked like you had a question, then you had a comment. If you're on, would you like to ask your question?
Sure, thanks. I was thinking about your statement that Western women don't squat. And then it occurred to me that when I'm doing gardening work, I'm doing exactly that you showed. So I'm thinking that you might ask women giving birth about physical activities, and you may find a subset of women who do squat regularly and who are very comfortable. That would be a test group.
And people who do yoga, we do a lot of squatting, but maybe not as early on in our lives as we should be doing.
Well, you might find a dose response effect. That would be easy. I mean, it would be easy perhaps to screen a number of women and then look at labor. My other comment was about the women in Da Nang. My experience in Lhasa, Tibet, and in Andean cities is that as women become modern and have prenatal care, they often come in contact with OBGYNs who tell them that it would be really good for them to have C-sections because it would be the modern way to have birth. That's it. Thanks.
Okay, thank you, Cynthia. Ron Willis, you have your hand up. Would you like to ask a question?
Yes, thank you. I don't know anything about childbirth really, but my daughter is a GP, primary care physician in England, and had a baby 2 weeks ago. And my wife is a neonatologist here in Chicago. So I asked them both, showed them the paper, and they thought it was plausible. They'd heard of it before, and but unproven. And so they really, their focus was on, is there any evidence about the impact on the babies in terms of morbidity, mortality, which from an evolutionary perspective would be very important.
So Ronald, do you mean like if a baby was born to a woman who'd squatted and who had an easier childbirth? Is that what you mean?
Yes. Does it have some kind of preferential benefit or however you would describe it?
Well, I mean, this is again, just one would imagine that if a woman had an easier birth that took less time and there was less incident of things like dystocia, other complications of childbirth, that it would reduce the morbidity of the baby that was being born as well.
Yes, one would imagine, but we wondered if there are any studies or from...
Well, I remember this. So the studies that I cited in the presentation that were, there was a meta-analysis and a Cochrane review. When they looked at the outcomes for the babies, there were no differences between the groups that squatted versus didn't. But again, these were studies where they admitted the quality of the data are poor, and where women are not necessarily the best model for these kinds of studies because, they're not a habitual squatting population, or many of them weren't in these studies.
Yeah, that makes sense. You need a comparable populations to do it on.
That particular study was very much about squatting or not squatting.
Yes, during labor.
During
labor. And often these studies recruit women and maybe they give them a quick physio, physio course before while they're pregnant. And then they randomize them into squatting or not squatting during the second stage of labor. But that's not the perfect model. And many of the studies that we read for this paper talked about how women just could not maintain a squatting posture or became exhausted by squatting after 10 minutes. So, again, it just introduces all these problems into trying to do a study on women who are not used to doing this deep kind of squat.
Yeah, I just wanted to, see what there was on the baby side of the other.
Could I sort of emphasize, in a way, how difficult it is mechanically to get from where we all are now, if the statistics are right? In other words, there's basically no mobility in the sacra-iliac joint, plus or minus 2 degrees, to a situation where there's 30 degrees. That means a full inch in AP and lateral pelvic outlet diameters. The amount of stretch required in that sacrotuberous ligament is not easily achieved, remembering that ligament is the connection between the back muscles and the leg muscles in lifting. So in a lifestyle where there's an awful lot of groundwork that would be under constant tension and might be long, but just a bit of stretching in a daily exercise or something isn't going to change the situation. So not certain whether I've explained that, but I'm saying stretching that sacrotuberous ligament is no easy task. It has a tensile strength measured in tons.
So Ronald, how are you going to respond to your wife and daughter?
To my wife and daughter.
Yeah, aren't they the ones who asked this question about the
Well, they are very much
hypothesis.
evidence-based physicians, and you know, but being a young mother as well, so they're open to see what comes with future studies, I guess.
I don't know
whether
whether.
ask, right? That you said that they asked you about this. What's
Yes.
the evidence?
Yeah. Yes.
Okay. Okay. Lou Muglia from Burroughs Wellcome Fund. Please go ahead with your question.
Thanks, Charlie, and thanks for the presentation. Maybe I missed this. I'm an endocrinologist by training, interested in pregnancy outcomes, and the notion of, you know, squatting and birth outcomes. I was just wondering if there was any evidence that squatting, either acutely or chronically, causes release of hormones like relaxins that might promote pelvic dilation by virtue of sort of mechanical effects or other things that are experienced by the joints, ligaments as you're squatting.
I don't know of any studies that have shown that relaxin is released more by that. I mean, as far as I was aware, it was mostly produced during pregnancy in preparation for birth. But that's an interesting question.
It is an interesting
Yeah.
question. Yeah.
The paper which you mentioned earlier, which actually suggested that, do you remember which one it was?
The meta-analysis, or
It was a meta-analysis,
Yes.
yes. Anyway, one paper that we both looked at, basically says it makes no difference what the birth position is. That whether they were squatting or not made no difference. That was the conclusion of that particular paper.
but they weren't. I don't think they were measuring relaxin specifically there.
No, sorry, no, they weren't. Sorry.
No, but I think it'd be interesting if that in some way chronically, you know, prepares you for the process by, you know, sort of allowing the ligaments to relax and perhaps stretch a little bit more even before pregnancy.
Well, it's if women, regardless of whether they squat or not, though, are going to have increased levels of relaxin. So it's not that squatting is what's producing the relaxin. You will
No,
get it
but I'm
no
just
matter-
wondering if squatting, in fact, separately leads to induction of relaxin that might prepare women, you know, ahead of time for being more successful with the birth process.
That's an interesting question. I really don't know the answer to that.
Nor do I. I just want to emphasize again there, we're talking about the flexion of the sacrum within the pelvis, which applies to all people, male and female. And incidentally, well, basically solves the low back pain problem as well. If the pelvis, if there's minimal mobility in the lowest two lumbar joints, the L4, 5 and the L5S joints, and the sacrum always remains prominent, even in even when the body is flexed and horizontal. And that basically removes the need and the trigger for low back pain. So the two are very closely connected.
But yes, that's a really interesting question, which we will have to follow up.
Yes.
Thanks for that question, Lou. We have some other people with hands raised. Nicole, would you like to ask your question?
Thank you. And thanks to the three presenters for a very interesting talk. I'm interested in pelvic joint mobility, and there hasn't been a lot of attention on this topic, I think. So thank you for bringing that more to all of our attention. Just to switch gears slightly, in the conclusion of your paper, you argue that your hypothesis or your argument that it obviates hypotheses explaining trade-offs in the pelvis. Whereas it seems to me that this hypothesis that you've put forward, if anything, it would seem to, it would be an explanation of mediation or amelioration of the obstetrical dilemma as one explanation invoking trade-offs. I don't really see how your hypothesis addresses the OD specifically. So maybe you could expand a little bit on why you think this hypothesis would actually argue against a scenario of trade-offs.
I think what we meant by that was the obstetrical dilemma, which has been criticized on many grounds anyway, was always cast in the context of a trade-off between being able to walk efficiently as a biped and being able to birth a child. And if the model that fed into the obstetrical dilemma is this idea that women have a hugely problematic childbirth, which obviously it did because it was grounded in our understanding from contemporary populations of childbirth being extremely difficult. But if you take away that part of the obstetrical dilemma hypothesis, i.e. that childbirth for our ancestors was not as problematic as we tend to see it today, then that's what we meant by it obviating that part of the dilemma, because you're taking away the whole idea that you have this trade-off because childbirth itself is not hugely difficult. Does that make sense?
Yes, it does. Thank you. I guess I would disagree because I think you can still have both. Just that obviously pelvic laxity or pelvic joint mobility would make the situation a little less dire than perhaps people have sketched it to be, which is obviously true. But I think the numbers, and I'm not talking just about C-sections, which can be, carried out for a plethora of reasons. But as you also describe in the paper, there really are incidences of obstructed labor and associated mortality and morbidity risks. So plus sexual dimorphism in the pelvis, clearly females do have a much more spacious pelvic canal. And that's, in my opinion, my informed opinion, that's difficult to explain away. And in my view, it seems that your hypothesis and kind of this added level of explanation would basically say that, okay, it's not quite as dramatic as we may have thought, but it doesn't really speak against bipedalism somehow favoring a narrower pelvis or pelvic floor functionality, nor that giving birth to larger babies obviously favors a larger pelvis.
So are you talking specifically about the obstetrical dilemma in relation to efficient bipedal walking? Because as we reviewed in the paper, there have been a lot of criticisms of that by Warner, for example, and other people who've done experiments that've shown that there are no, that basically there's not such huge differences in the way that males and females walk.
I'm not. I'm talking about a scenario more generally speaking of evolutionary trade-offs. However, just because there may be other studies that seem to counter the bipedalism argument, your hypothesis doesn't. So I was, but maybe I misunderstood your conclusion. Maybe your conclusion was grounded also in the empirical studies that you cited. Although in my opinion, again, I think we probably need a few more studies in order to really know the effect of pelvic morphology and a broader range of variation in pelvic morphology across populations, across perhaps age categories, not just amateur athletes, and the effect on energetic efficiency or whatever bipedal performance to really know whether or not that argument is true.
Yeah.
Can I make another comment here? I've read, to get myself up to speed, I've read a lot of different papers which had obstetric dilemma in the headline. And may I say what I think the obstetric, can people see my hands? I don't know. I'm going to plow ahead anyway and assuming they can. My understanding of the obstetric dilemma is a quadruped is basically a cylinder. And the birth canal is at this end, and the legs are attached to the outside of the cylinder, and the spine goes along the top of the cylinder. When you turn that thing on end to make it a biped, you've got the spine here and you've got the legs here. And that doesn't work. You've got to move the spine forward to be in line with the legs, and that blocks off the birth canal. That's the dilemma, the obstetric dilemma, or my understanding. Do you agree?
Well, I think, I think definitions of what the obstetrical dilemma is exactly maybe goes a little bit beyond the scope of this conversation, because it has been differentially defined. But I guess that's one interpretation. Okay, I will stop. Thank you very much.
Thank you.
Thanks for the great question, Nicole. I really appreciated it. And this is a useful discussion. Karen, were you going to respond to this line of question?
I would love to. Thank you, Charlie.
Okay, please go ahead.
So I want to say that I appreciate Nicole's question very much. I think there's no question that what the authors of this piece and Jonathan Wells are saying, that childbirth difficulties in the present are not necessarily a good indication of what they were in the past. I totally accept that. But I think that, like as Nicole said, the presence and the pattern of sexual dimorphism in the pelvis in humans indicates that there is differential selection on males and females. And I actually think that the fact that we have all this pelvic laxity, which presumably has some costs attached to it, is kind of further evidence of selection on the pelvis coming from childbirth, right? That in a way, and again, speaking just in a sort of pre-agricultural time period, that the fact that accommodation gets made so often, which again I assume has some kind of costs associated with it, means that there are some difficulties that are being alleviated by that laxity.
Can you?
So I don't know if Wenda might want to pipe up.
Yeah, and Karen, could you just provide some examples of what those costs might be?
I guess, that was pretty vague, and maybe that's because I'm not, I'd appreciate input about that. But I assume that there are orthopedic costs, for example. I'm not really sure, but maybe somebody here does know more.
So Karen, also, I mean, when you're talking about laxity, you're talking about pelvic floor issues as well as one of the trade-offs here that you're referring to?
Absolutely.
Okay. Because right, I think
so that's something.
Yeah, one of the things that I think that we also haven't perhaps paid enough attention to, and I'm sure that any woman here who's gone through childbirth might have been told by her obstetrician about pelvic floor exercises once you've given birth. But I think that probably people who also had a very active lifestyle and were squatting a lot probably strengthened their pelvic floors too. Whereas, nowadays we are sitting around all the time where we're not doing the kinds of things that really are good for our pelvic floor, shall we say. So it's quite likely that, again, we don't have a very good understanding about the physiological health of women in the past who were doing the kinds of activities that might also have spared their pelvic floor from the damage that occurs during modern obstetrics.
Absolutely. And I'm sure that the incredibly high rate of pelvic floor injuries that we see today is not indicative of what people would have experienced in the past. I'm sure that's true for the very lifestyle reasons that you mentioned.
Thank you, those great comments.
Okay, we're getting close to the top of the hour, but I think we can fit in a couple more questions. Let's see, Peggy, would you like to go again, Peggy? Go ahead.
Yes. Thanks. I also have a comment to Lou. I don't know if he's still here. So we see much more birth injuries on the pelvic floor in women from Asia. So where we see the population where they squat a lot, as usually. So there is a is not a correlation or positive correlation with that. So it doesn't seem to help to ease the birth. Maybe it's eased the birth, but the injuries are severe after that. And yes, it doesn't say anything about the strength of the pelvic floor. Maybe it's too straight. But on the other hand, we have very young women in Asia with the first baby, and if the pelvic floor is not the old one and he's not so stretchy as an older woman, so maybe that's the reason. I think it's not, you cannot see any correlation between sitting or not sitting. So just because there are multifactorial situation and you cannot pull out one of them and say, oh, we have a correlation. Maybe it's not a causation. So you have a correlation, but no causation for that. So then I would, so that was just a comment.
Thank you.
Thank you.
I hope it would be easier, but it doesn't seem so. So the data, all the obstetrical data say the things.
That's great. Comments are great. I was trying to remember to remind everyone to reply. You know, other people can speak up if they know information about, you know, a particular question or whatever. So that's great. Thank you. Thank you very much, Peggy. Okay, Nicole, would you like to ask your question?
Yeah, it was mainly just a kind of a comment to add on. First of all, thank you for the great presentation, and thank you for putting these ideas out there for us to test. This is very exciting, and I'm very interested in looking at archaeological collections in the future to see whether or not we can see differences in pelvic dimensions and things like that. But what I wanted to say about the pelvic floor is I think it's interesting with the squatting that it could potentially just move the pelvic floor a bit out of the way. So these people that have these active lifestyles could actually have like a hypertonus type of situation where there's too much tone in the pelvic floor. And this is actually something that I think is underestimated in just even regular populations just doing exercise. But exercise in general is supposed to make birth easier. So there's this element, but then people who tend to be engaging in exercise tend to have these tighter pelvic floors, and the squatting that they tell you to do, especially in late pregnancy, is supposed to kind of just move the pelvic floor, relax it enough so it gets out of the way and isn't really obstructing anything as much or causing these type of drastic tears. So I think actually the squatting could be helpful for just getting the pelvic floor to relax, not even necessarily for the dimensions of the pelvis, because I think there's a lot of ways to squat that you wouldn't be able to infer from the archaeological record. Yeah, the way I squatted in birth was not sitting up on my feet. You couldn't do that for 8 hours, I agree, but maybe even 10 minutes would be difficult. But if you can sit back on your legs and you can still get your pelvis in that position, I mean, it's still worth something. So I think actually the deep squats are better for that purpose, which is just a comment I wanted to add into our discussion. Thank you.
Thanks, Nicole. That's great. Thank you very much for bringing that up.
Yeah, thank you.
So we're close to the top of the hour, and I just wanted to close things out by turning to each of our participants, Charlotte, John, and Gillian, and ask you what you think are the most important directions for testing this hypothesis. You're really clear in the paper that this is a hypothesis. You've got, you know, some evidence for it. We've talked throughout the presentation about different ways to test the hypothesis. But I just would like to hear from each of you, you know, as closing remarks, what you think are the most important next directions for this.
Well, actually, when we were like waiting, you know, before everybody came on, we had a very interesting conversation with Becca, who is apparently studying gait in Homo erectus and is using a digital model of a pelvis. So I think we're going to have some continued conversation, because maybe this might be one way of trying to model some of the different forces, pelvic size, positions, that maybe if we could do something digital, it might be a really interesting way of testing this further. Yeah, so that got us excited, I think, right at the beginning.
That's great.
That it's very interesting to talk to Becca at the beginning. Trying to answer your question though, I see obviously a very close connection between birth problems and low back problems. They really come from the same technical problem. If I was to guess how the next step would be, surgical interventions for back problems would have the side effect of getting the pelvic, the sacra-iliac mobility back to the natural level. That would be interesting to see whether that would actually solve two problems with one question.
I don't know if there's any bioarchaeologists out there, but looking at these markers that have been accepted by quite a few people now as indicators of squatting and relating the presence or absence with pelvic measuring, that would be good for bioarchaeology to pursue, I think. And look at, looking at a long time period as well, from prehistoric right through to the industrial period. There's a PhD for someone.
Okay, thank you all very much for this excellent presentation and for stimulating such great conversation. There's obviously a lot more we could talk about. There are other questions and comments in the chat, but we just don't have time for all that. I'm really sorry about that. But anyhow, really exciting and great to showcase this work. So thank you very much. Now, before